You probably imagine pirates mostly fighting with swords and searching for treasure, but their main problem wasn't other sailors or the navy. It was something much easier to overlook: finding clean water to drink. Let me share a funny story about sailing in the 1700s. This could hold enough salted meat and hardtack to feed a crew for months, but water? That stuff would turn into a nasty mix of algae and bacteria quicker than you could shout, "Yo ho ho!" A typical pirate needed at least a gallon of water each day just to survive the blazing Caribbean heat. Do the math. For a crew of 50 pirates, that's 50 gallons of water each day. No surprise that water was sometimes worth more than gold. Here's where it gets intriguing. A bit gross, too. Some desperate pirates actually attempted to drink seawater when they ran out of fresh water. Terrible idea. Truly a terrible idea. Seawater contains roughly 3.5% salt, far more than what our bodies can process. Drinking it essentially signals to your kidneys, hey, it's both time and work to handle this, causing your body to use up more water trying to eliminate the excess salt than what you originally drank. A few pirates found out the hard way, and let's just say it wasn't a pretty sight. I once came across a story about a pirate ship stuck without fresh water for days, and some crew members, so desperate for a drink, began chugging seawater mixed with wine, hoping the alcohol would make it safe. Spoiler alert. It didn't. Most of them ended up terribly ill, and it actually made things a lot worse for them. You'd think someone would have come up with a better idea, but keep in mind, this was way before plastic containers or water purification systems existed. Their best option was to store the water in the coolest spot on the ship, usually in the lower deck, but even then, the constant rolling of the vessel, along with the heat and humidity, made clean water a rare treasure. There were times when the water crisis became so intense that pirates would totally alter their routes just after hearing about a new freshwater spring on some random island. Imagine being the most dreaded pirates in the Caribbean, only to have to take a detour because you're desperate for a sip of clean water. Talk about wrecking your terrifying reputation. On the topic of reputations, there's a lesser-known tale about the notorious Blackbeard. Most people see him as a terrifying pirate, known for lighting fuses in his beard to intimidate others, but what many overlook is that he was surprisingly shrewd when it came to water management. He'd particularly go after ships he knew carried fresh water with their cargo. Clever move, huh? When desperation hit its peak, pirates had to rely on their most dependable source, the sky. Believe me, the moment those rain clouds showed up on the horizon, you'd never see a crew spring into action so quickly. As the storm approached, the whole ship turned into a giant water collecting machine. The deck got busier than a seafood market on bargain day. Pirates had a clever method for collecting rain. They used their sails, those huge canvas sheets that normally captured the wind, as giant funnels when tilted properly. In storms, crew members would angle the sails precisely, forming what they called water channels to catch rainwater. Sometimes they'd argue over who got to position which sail because everyone knew the sails at the front caught the clearest water, with less bird poop to handle, if you catch my drift. The smart bit was how they made use of every surface on the boat. Those wooden railing gutters that typically prevented seawater from spilling onto the deck. When storms hit, they turned into channels, directing valuable freshwater into the waiting buckets. Some clever pirates even carved additional grooves into the deck planks to better direct more water toward their collection spots. But it wasn't all smooth sailing, pun fully intended. Rain collection brought its own challenges. For starters, the first rain that drenched the ship was typically quite grimy. It had been tainted by weeks of others using those sails as a bathroom, and the salt from the sea spray had accumulated all over. Clever pirates would wait for the initial burst of rain to wash away the dirt before they began collecting. They called it giving the deck its bath. Here's a funny little detail most history books overlook. During fierce storms, pirates would dash about with their hats turned upside down, trying to scoop up more water. Some would even rip off their shirts and squeeze them out into containers. One report from a Spanish merchant ship recounts watching a pirate crew that looked like. But rain wasn't always reliable. Sometimes ships would go weeks without spotting even a single cloud. That's when pirates had to get really inventive with their water-saving methods. They enforced strict rules on water use, more stringent even than the ones about fighting or dividing treasure. Trying to break the water rules might land you in more trouble than stealing from the captain himself. There's a pretty wild story about a pirate ship called the Morning Star, where a storm brought in so much rain that the crew collected enough to last them 2 extra weeks at sea. They marked the occasion with a rain feast, where everyone received an extra portion of water. It might not seem like much of a celebration now, but at the time, it was more valuable than stumbling upon a chest of gold. The most experienced pirates could even anticipate rain by observing the clouds and seabirds nearby. They'd change their whole course just to sail through spots where they hoped a strong storm would hit. It's almost as if some of those fierce pirates were secretly just master weather forecasters in disguise. Even with all these smart rain harvesting tricks, there were still moments when the sky refused to cooperate. That's when pirates had to rely on their fallback plan. When rain barrels emptied and the sky stayed blue, pirates had to become skilled water seekers on land. Skip the treasure maps, pirates valued their maps of freshwater springs and rivers even more. These water maps were kept under tighter lock and key than the locations of buried treasure, and rightly so. A reliable water source could be the key to survival or catastrophe. The initial skill every pirate picked up was spotting green plants. Seems simple enough, doesn't it? Yet, there's more to it than just spotting a nearby palm. Pirates discovered that some plants served as better signs of water sources than others. Coconut palms may appear tropical and lovely, but they can thrive in quite dry soil. The true moisture seekers were plants like ferns and dense grasses, which required steady hydration to survive. Some savvy pirates even learned to identify morning glory vines, as those almost always indicated nearby fresh water. This is where things get fascinating. These early workers were actually skilled at creating what we now call seepage wells. Around 50 feet inland from the shoreline, they would dig holes in the sand, and gradually, these holes would fill up with filtered freshwater. The sand worked like a natural filter, blocking the salt water and allowing fresh groundwater to flow in. Not bad for a bunch of guys who spent most of their time bending the rules. But my favorite way to find water has to be what I call the bird trick. Birds tend to keep an eye out for one another, especially around dawn or dusk. They also need to hydrate, often doing so at the same time each day. If you noticed a flock of birds all flying in the same direction, it's likely they were headed toward a water source. A pirate captain noted in his journal that his best water supply was discovered after trailing a group of parrots. He grumbled about their constant noise, feeling as if they were jeering at him all the way to it. This pirate's gotten so desperate that he's been raiding coastal towns just to get water. Now that's awkward. Picture being the most notorious pirates in the Caribbean, and instead of snatching gold or jewels, you're grabbing barrels of water. Here's a funny tale about a pirate crew that hit a Spanish settlement in 1718. They took all the water barrels, but felt so guilty they left a tiny bag of gold coins as a sort of apology. Turns out even pirates had their moments of conscience. The most adept water seekers knew how to interpret the land around them. They kept an eye out for V-shaped valleys, often filled with streams. In rocky terrain, they looked for dark streaks on cliffs, indicating water seeping from within the rocks. A few pirates even insisted they could smell water from afar, though that probably had more to do with the rum they were drinking than any real water detection ability. Some pirate groups actually kidnapped local guides who knew where water was, but more often than not, it ended up in pretty funny failures. A guide who was caught led a group in circles for 3 days before they finally figured out he was just joking around. Another guide did take them to a spring, but it was the one home to a bunch of very grumpy crocodiles. After a few such episodes, most pirates realized it was smarter to befriend the locals rather than force their help. One of the most clever methods I've come across was the dew collection trick. Pirates would dig angled pits and line them with big leaves. In the morning, dew would gather on the leaves and dash into the containers. It wasn't much, but when you're desperate for fresh water, every drop matters. Still, finding water was only half the challenge. Once the pirates had their precious fresh water, they needed a place to store it, and those wooden barrels they used weren't exactly the best containers. The toughest part for pirates wasn't actually sourcing water, but keeping it drinkable in those huge wooden barrels. These weren't your typical backyard beer kegs. We're talking massive hogshead barrels that could hold up to 63 gallons apiece. A reasonably large pirate ship would require around 30 of these creatures just to store enough water for a month on the open sea. Do the calculations. That's nearly 2,000 gallons shifting around in the hold. The true threat wasn't the barrels themselves, but what began to develop inside them after a few weeks afloat. The mix of heat, humidity, and wooden walls made for an ideal environment for all sorts of ugly things to thrive. Pirates referred to spoiled water as live water, since you could actually see tiny creatures swimming around in it. A pirate's journal from 1716 depicted it as tasting like swallowing a mouthful of wriggling worms with each sip. Delicious, isn't it? But pirates were pretty inventive when it came to combating spoilage. One of their top ideas was to char the insides of barrels, essentially transforming them into large water filters made of charcoal. They'd char the inner layer of the wood until it blackened, forming a protective shield. This is the same method still used today for making whiskey barrels. Though I highly doubt the pirates had aged bourbon in mind when they first came up with it. Pirates found that tossing silver coins into their water barrels helped keep the water fresh for a longer time. They weren't aware of bacteria back then, but they believed silver had some kind of magical cleaning power. Today's science has confirmed they were onto something. Silver truly possesses innate antibacterial qualities. Talk about hitting the jackpot with silver. Even the most careful pirates would seal their barrel joints using a blend of tar and resin. Some crews went further, creating their own secret formulas for barrel sealant, blending in ingredients like beeswax and coconut oil. Once, there was a pirate captain so defensive of his barrel sealing formula that he made his crew turn away whenever he used it. When he was eventually caught, the British Navy proposed shortening his sentence if he would reveal his secret. He likely took what many consider the greatest barrel sealing recipe in history to his grave. Temperature also played a major role in water storage. Pirates discovered that placing barrels in the coldest areas of the ship helped slow down spoilage. But here's the catch. The bottom deck of the ship, where it was coolest, also experienced the most movement. You had to pick between water that was a bit less rotten or barrels that weren't always trying to break loose and roll around the hold like bowling balls during an earthquake. A rather inventive team attempted to wrap their barrels in damp sailcloth, thinking the evaporation would keep them cool. It was a clever idea in theory, but all they achieved was moldy sailcloth and water that still spoiled. Some crew members attempted to paint their barrels white to reflect the heat, but they soon found out that paint in the 1700s often contained lead. It certainly helped the water last longer, but not in a healthy way. The most amusing efforts to conserve water came from superstitious pirates convinced that evil spirits were the cause of bad water. They hold intricate blessing rituals over fresh barrels, including singing, dancing, and luck. One crew went as far as hiring a water witch to bless theirs. Interestingly, their water stayed fresh for a longer time, likely because the witch was secretly adding charcoal to the barrels when no one was watching. But despite all these clever tricks, pirates still faced the problem of water going bad. When the barrel water turned green and started sprouting things, they had to come up with a backup solution, and that's when they got really inventive with their own homemade systems. Their homemade water filtration techniques varied from surprisingly inventive to downright hilarious desperation. Did they try to filter water using their hat? Yep, pirates did that. But I wouldn't recommend drinking anything that's passed through a pirate's hat. The simple pirate water filter was pretty straightforward. Just take a piece of clean cloth, or at least what counted as clean on a pirate ship, stretch it over a container, and pour the murky water through. It caught the larger debris, like those tiny wriggling worms and bits of floating algae. A pirate recorded in his journal that after filtering, the cloth would turn so green it resembled seaweed stuck to his finest shirt. A few inventive pirates even attempted to replicate what they'd observed on tropical islands, where water naturally sifted through layers of sand and rock. They'd put together small filtration setups with whatever they had available on board: broken pottery, crushed seashells, and even pieces of coral they'd collected during their last raid. One captain insisted that passing water through a layer of shattered pearl necklaces made it taste much nicer. It's a pretty pricey water filter, in my view. I've heard that in the past, some pirates experimented with desalinating seawater by boiling it and capturing the steam. They'd hang wet cloths over boiling seawater, let them soak up the condensation, and then wring them out into clean containers. Did it work? Sort of. Was it worth the trouble? Given that it took roughly a gallon of water's worth of wood to boil enough seawater for 1 cup of fresh water, you can do the math. The prize for the most frantic filtration method goes to a crew that tried to filter their water through tobacco leaves after hearing that tobacco kills germs. It ended up tasting like someone had dumped an ashtray into the water. Maybe smoking the water would have worked better, though knowing pirates, someone probably gave that a shot too. When they had citrus fruits, pirates would sometimes squeeze them into their filtered water for a bit of flavor. They weren't simply making pirate lemonade for fun. The acidity actually helped eliminate some dangerous bacteria. It also prevented scurvy, so it was like hitting 2 birds with 1 stone. Sadly, most pirates had no clue why this was effective. Giving the water time. If you left contaminated water in a clean container long enough, the harmful substances would eventually settle at the bottom. Pirates nicknamed this sleeping water because they'd let it rest for a while before drinking. Not exactly a scientific reason, but hey, when you're stranded in the ocean with only questionable water to drink, any excuse will do. On the topic of questionable water, some pirates handled their spoiled water quite differently. While it's a bit gross, this method saved many lives at sea. Many people believe pirates drank rum just because they liked to get drunk. That's just part of the story. Their real goal was survival. Rum wasn't just for fun, it served as their kind of water purifier. When mixed with water to make grog, it helped eliminate bacteria and turned even the worst-tasting water into something somewhat drinkable. The official way to make grog was pretty straightforward. Use 1 part rum, combine it with 4 parts water, and if you're feeling extra, throw in a splash of lime juice. And there you go, just crafted a pirate's take on a water purification system. Sanitizing your water and getting your vitamin C in the same drink. However, pirates didn't actually invent grog. It was first made by British Admiral Edward Vernon in 1740. Sailors called him Old Grog because he wore a grog-gram cloak, a type of coarse cloth, and that's how the drink got its name. They just took the idea, like they did with most things. Though I doubt they ever filed a patent for their version, the math behind grog is actually pretty interesting. A standard pirate ship with 50 crew members would consume around 70 gallons of rum each week just to make grog. That's over a gallon for each person. Naturally, some of that rum vanished mysteriously before reaching the grog barrel. Pirates referred to this as the angel's share. Though, these angels seem to have quite the drinking habit. Each pirate captain had their own unique grog recipe. Some put in sugar to improve the flavor, while others added spices like nutmeg or cinnamon. One especially inventive captain even tossed in mint leaves and dubbed it a Caribbean cocktail. Looks like he was a few centuries ahead of the mojito craze. The clever pirate captains used grog rations to regulate their crew's water intake. That Irish sailor received a set amount of grog each day. Drinking too much plain water would spoil, but grog could hold up longer. It was sort of like a drink ticket system at a bar, except instead of stopping drunks from ordering more shots, it was keeping thirsty pirates from consuming the entire ship's water supply all at once. There's this funny story from a captured merchant sailor who described pirates bickering over their grog supplies. Apparently, one pirate tried to persuade his captain that he deserved more because he was twice as thirsty as the average sailor. The captain's reply? That means you could end up twice as thirsty, even with the same amount as everyone else. Pirates might have been outlaws, but they still believed in fairness when it came to sharing the grog. Not everyone was a big fan of the stuff, though. Null, assistant. One crew actually needed to mute because their captain diluted the grog too much. Turns out, there's a fine line between water purification and sparking a pirate uprising. The most fascinating thing about the grog wasn't the drink itself. That's how it transformed pirate culture. The daily grog ration became such a fixture in their lives that they actually based their entire day around it. No ship attack happened before grog time, and serious arguments didn't start until everyone had their share. Despite all these techniques, rain harvesting, land searching, barrel stacking, grog brewing, and homemade filtering, pirates still found it tough to maintain clean water on their ships. But that's what pushed them to be so inventive. Armed only with wooden barrels, a bit of cloth, a handful of silver coins, and lots of rum, they made it through months at sea. They were performing some strange rain dance, but honestly, they were just trying to gather as much water as possible.